So, on behalf of Transport Infrastructure Ireland, I'd like to welcome you all here today. This is a new initiative, I suppose, in terms of Irish road scheme projects, in that the opportunity has arisen through the new quality price contract that we have, and also through the research partnership that Transport Infrastructure Ireland has been involved in over the last 4 years, I suppose, with the Instar funded Seeing Beyond the Sight project, which Dr. Katarina Becker and Dr. Ben Geary in University College Cork are the principal investigators. And through that project, as Katarina will tell you, a lot of work and research has been done on the results and analysing the results of excavations that have been carried out on road schemes, broadly speaking, in Munster and South Leinster over the last, I suppose, 15 to 20 years. And one of the outcomes of that research has been a focus on radiocarbon dating and chronological modelling, and a recognition that there's, I suppose, scope for changes in the approach that we take to sampling for radiocarbon dating, and that also the decisions that are taken on site have a significant influence and impact on the dating of archaeological sites. And as we know, in terms of the study of archaeology, building and having robust chronological models are very important, whether you're working at the site level, so in other words, dating individual phases on a site, but also then putting those sites into an overall chronological framework for a local area or a region. And so that's why, in terms of a public body spending public money, from our perspective as TII, it's very important that the money that we spend both on the excavation of the sites, but also then on, for instance, radiocarbon dating, is well spent, so that at the end of the process we can turn around to the public who fund the work that we do and say that not only did we excavate these sites very well, but the selection of samples that we made and the decisions that were made in terms of what was to be dated as one element of the excavation led to the optimum outcome, which ultimately will allow academics in years to come and other researchers to build on the work that, for instance, is done here in Listowel. So that, I suppose, just by way of a very brief overview and kind of introduction. The real meat of this morning's training is going to be delivered by Dr. Katarina Becker from the Department of Archaeology in University College Cork, and Dr. Derek Hamilton from the Scottish University's Environmental.
That's a mouthful. SUAC.
So the radiocarbon dating facility that a lot of you will be familiar with in terms of submitting samples to and so on. So without further ado, I will introduce Katarina and ask her to take it away.
Thanks very much, James. Thanks very much to James and Paul and AMS and everybody who came out today for having us. I think it's a great opportunity for us to kind of tell a little bit about what we've been trying to do and the kind of issues we've encountered in this, and perhaps for us most excitingly also where we see the great potential of the Irish data and the work of the future. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction into my period of study, which is later prehistory, and in particular how the data from the various infrastructural schemes over the past decades has impacted this very, very significantly. And then I'm going to lead you through where I see us now in terms of what we have achieved so far and where I think we should be going from this point onwards. And that's kind of hopefully going to lead more or less seamlessly to Derek with some examples and explanations about what the potential is of these methodologies we're talking about today. So As you might still remember from your undergrad days or postgrad days, or whenever you had to sit in lectures about Irish later prehistory, you were shown maps like these about Irish Iron Age in particular. We know nothing. It's the enigmatic period. It's the dark age of the later prehistory. There's no sites. There's no artifacts except for a little bit of high status latten and gold material. Were there even people living in Munster? This is all very strange. We don't understand. Whole volumes of Imania dedicated to the question of, is there an Iron Age in Munster? So people speculated, of course, about possibly taphonomic reasons being at the source of the problem, that we just don't recognize sites because they are perhaps built in a way or constructed in a way that they might not survive in the archaeological record. Sites that perhaps look like those of other periods, so we don't recognize them, and a variety of other possible explanations for this lack of archaeology, and in particular settlement archaeology, were considered to be lying at the root of this problem. Now, then the Celtic Tiger started, and something happened that changed the picture quite dramatically. Now, I've thrown various or all dates for the study period, later prehistory, up to about 400 AD onto these maps, and you can see there's a significant difference. And already, you've seen this probably before, you've seen papers on Neolithic in Ireland or the early medieval period in Ireland. They have strikingly similar distribution patterns these days because they are aligned along the routes, they're aligned along the roads, along the gas pipelines. So that in its very essence already tells you what the contribution of these infrastructural schemes to this new archaeological record is in terms of the sheer mass of data that has been generated over the past decades. So you see very clearly the various road schemes through the country. You see this big concentration around Dublin as well. And it is notable how, though there were also infrastructural schemes up there, how much less is going on in the north of the country. So this balances out our kind of existing archaeological records in terms of the artifacts, which always had a funny northern distribution. Now we see, of course, there were people in the south of the country. There was life there in the Iron Age. Now we're kind of laughing about that question almost, you know, but it is something that that needed to be proven. And you can see here various papers. No, I didn't, that's just literally from my CV, kind of chucked in there, various papers that just deal with this new archaeology. So it's a very rich archaeological record that we have over the past, well, at this point, close to a decade, I would say, started to get to grips with. So, and like yourselves, when you're faced with a huge new body of material, be it on a site or on a larger regional level, you have to get to grips with it. You have to start to systematize it in some sort of way. You have to start to get a handle on it. And that's what we did in the past years. We started to categorize the material. We started to assess it. We started to draw out the kind of big picture conclusions about, yes, there were people in the south. Yes, there was Iron Age archaeology everywhere, pretty much. Wherever you set a spade to the ground or a digger to the ground, you will find probably some sort of Iron Age archaeology in some sort of context. So we've been looking at big picture stuff so far. And part of this big picture assessment is, for example, the recognition of the existence of houses. Now, still dramatically flimsy record in comparison to previous and later periods, but we do have them, and they have distinct typologies, they have distinct morphologies that allow us now to discuss them in relation to how people might have used them, might have lived there. We still have to deal with the issue of, did people actually permanently live in those settlement sites, or were they actually probably quite transient? We are not entirely sure what is going on. If you look at this distribution map, for example, you see the black circles. That's all the roundhouses that have really nicely, and the stars as well, distinct, that are proper roundhouses, post-built ones, where you have the purple crosses. These are ring ditch built ground houses. Well, you know, some people might even still discuss them as barrows. You know, it doesn't quite work as barrows, but they're a bit funny. You know, there's a regional division there as well. So we really need to understand this better, right? And that is really, I think, the theme of this talk today, really, and where we're trying to move towards with making suggestions about how to go about this. We need to understand things better now, right? So this is the base. This is now where we're coming from, but we want to find out more. We want to understand better. So we have roundhouses in various parts of the country. There are different types of constructing these. We have started, and everybody's probably going to cringe at these block lines between the periods, and I cringe at them, though I made that table myself, so don't look. But we have now site types that we can start to try to put together in a way that we can say, okay, these things are contemporary, these things are coming on at the same time. For example, we have evidence for iron working coming on about 500 BC-ish. Some sites are supposedly already 8th, 7th century BC. Actually, I should have picked them as examples for today. I don't believe them, I don't trust them. I think there's dating issues there. We can try to understand how all these different parts of the archaeological record relate to each other chronologically. And that will allow us to understand what is really going on culturally as well. So we can start to talk about what happens at the end of the Late Bronze Age, or when is it actually, you know, a bigger, it's a very nebulous period, you know. So I can actually show within the data set that all of us, you have generated, that there is quite a significant breaks in the beginning and the ending of particular site types. And as archaeologists, we want to understand, obviously, in how change works over time, and how it is actually how it is actually timed. And differentiation is going to be very difficult there. And these vertical lines you see here are definitely going to be a thing of the past when we start to develop more complex models of how different aspects of people's lives and culture changed over time. But that has been a major contribution of this new archaeological record, that we can now put stuff into a table to start with. And another really, really amazing insight that this data set has given us, of course, is that we start to see a picture of landscape use in this period, where we previously had no idea how people lived. So here from an area in kind of the intersection between Clare, Tipperary, and Limerick, we see how various schemes that partially then cross over each other, gas pipelines intersecting with road schemes, etc. We can see how these long linear trenches that we are actually digging through the landscape, test trenches if you want, of ginormous sizes. I know ginormous is not a word, but I do use it. How these actually reveal to us how different landscapes were used in different ways. And we can also look at that then over time and see how people in different periods then change their use. So here in this example, we have an amazing landscape where we can see black dots, settlement sites, and triangles being, ironworking sites, and the triangles being the burials, being in lower lying areas that are quite wet, marginal lands. And as soon as you're getting in slightly higher elevations, you get the yellow dots, which are house or occupation sites. So, and then connected also here in this case by the trackway, the two white symbols there, the various Anahalti trackways that also produced amazing artifacts of that period. So we are getting a transect through different parts of the landscape, and we see that people are living on the slight elevations. That's a picture that's emerging all over Ireland more and more. We're not looking at hill forts in the Iron Age. We're not looking really at lowland settlement, but we're looking at the hillocks, the bumps and lumps in the landscape where people seem to have been kind of settling on kind of middle ground. That's a hypothesis at the moment based on a couple of sites, a few sites. So, and then we have them kind of crossing over wet areas then to get to another settlement site. And we have evidence for pastoral and arable agriculture as well associated with these sites. Now, there's still many, many open questions about this, and one of them in particular is how that actually works out fine chronologically. So I'm showing you here two maps of the same reason. Now, this is from the project that James mentioned in Southeast Ireland, which we did collaboratively with SURC, with the TII as one of our main partners and co-funders, and with a variety of other institutions. And I'm showing you here a map of distribution of sites in the Hallstatt Plateau, 800 to 400. I'm not calling it late Bronze Age, I'm not calling it early Iron Age. It's some sort of transitional horizon, but what you can see is very little going on. And then from about 400 BC to about, let's say, the 1st century AD, you see suddenly in this time bracket lots of site in the landscape. So there's something very dramatic happening here, something that suggests either people moving away or to other locations that we don't happen to capture in those roads, or there being a real impact on the levels of occupation and demography. And that's something we have also played with in those papers there on the right-hand side. That's something that has been very popular in recent years. People trying to look at these large data sets and trying to use them as an approximation, as a proxy for activity levels for demography in the past, and that's a very contentious thing. But we can certainly, in terms of the chronological resolution of this, how can we really tie that down, and is it what we're measuring here really population levels, or is it people shifting within the landscape? But what we can say for certain is that within those landscapes that we are transacting with these roads, we see change that reflects something about how and where the people live. And we're trying in that project to link this in with the pollen and climate records as well. And that is something we'll continue doing as well. So this record serves on various levels to really enlighten us on fundamental, in a fundamental way about life in the past. And this is particularly felt in a period where there was so little before. So the question then is, are we happy with how things are? Are we just going to keep doing the same? Are we going to do another 10, 20 years of doing exactly the same and end up next time I come to you to present with a map that has double the amount of dots and double the amount of houses on the slide? Is that all we want to achieve, or is there more to achieve? And I would make the case, and that is what I'm throwing out here today, and that's where we're going to make a few suggestions as well. For my own research, I'm finding myself at a place now where I say, oh, this is great, I've got these maps, I've written about them now, this is the state of knowledge that we have, this is what I can say. But I can't say anything more, but I want to be able to say more. I want to be able, for example, to describe how things change within these large chronological blocks. Hallstatt Plateau, earlier Iron Age, later Iron Age. I want to be able to say, well, this is what happens between 400 and 200 BC, and this is what happens between 0 BC and 200 AD, let's say. And I want to be able to make statements that are actually supportable and that I can actually stand over, that are not just up to negotiation and suggestions. We have, and this is now, this graphic representation here is showing you within the Southeast Ireland INSTAR project the different types of sites that we have, and already you see immediately a big chunk of green. We've been dating, and this is just the dated sites, this is not the undated ones. We've been dating a whole lot of Fulacht Fia. And I know there's a general sentiment across the profession, oh, not another Fulacht, and they're boring. That's not what I'm going to say. I'm going to say Fulacht Fia are really interesting sites. They're really fascinating sites. And having studied them within our region, they're is very little, though, I can say about them, in spite of this really large number we've excavated and dated. And I'm going to show you why that is. We also have a lot of sites that are difficult to categorize, that really don't tell us very much. Here, the blue stuff, activity, pit, stakes, and post holes. These are sites that are not necessarily, as you might think, when you come across a site and there's just a pit and you date that. These are, this is a representation of all those dated contexts that I ended up categorizing as just that. They may have been beside a roundhouse, let's say, or a burial monument, but I couldn't relate them to this monument because it was unclear how they're dated or how the monument is dated. So, and you know, our sites are typically palimpsests. They're a bit of Neolithic, bit of Iron Age, bit of Bronze Age, bit of post-medieval thrown in. So, and without stratigraphic linkages between these characteristically. So, there's a lovely roundhouse here. There's a pit beside it that produced a late Bronze Age radiocarbon date. That doesn't mean this house is late Bronze Age. So that site, that whole site, wanders into my meaningless activity barrel because I can't link it in. I can't actually say what date this site dates to. And sometimes it's also unclear why we select then that pit on that site if we could also date the house. What is directing our choices? And having worked through this data set now, not being at this point initially, I was like, yeah, date all the pits because these pits produce Iron Age dates. That's great, right? But having worked through the data set now, I think we are now all together able to actually formulate questions that we want answering based on this data set. One of them would be for me to understand, for example, how phollacts develop over time, nice complex sites, how they actually constructed over time and used. For houses and burial sites, very similar sort of questions. So I think now we can start to make choices about what we date and what we investigate, because we start to get a sense of what we know and what we want to know. So, what has been happening so far? What has generated? And I think that's where we can see in action those things that we might want to tweak a little bit going forward. So very often we find what is basically, I've called it their shotgun approach to dating of sites. You could also call it a kind of rangefinder approach. So you're throwing dates at various features just to figure out what is what, basically. But very often on sites, that doesn't necessarily target those sites that we know there's a deficiency in knowledge about. And instead, features are targeted that are not of primary interest, I would say. On the other hand, I acknowledge also that this kind of random approach to dating has actually produced also a lot of stuff that is, for my period, really important. You know, a lot of the early Iron Age sites and features that were recognized were actually pits and the like, you know, where people just dated something, they didn't quite know what it was, and that's how we got our first dates. But as I said, I think we've established this now. Now we need to look at what we actually want to find out. What is a good investment of our time, work, and money? Reliance on single dates for the dating of features and sites is something that we see a lot in site reports. And now, again, I acknowledge that these two features are, not in this case, but in many other cases, part of a bigger site that also has some Neolithic stuff on it that you needed to date and some medieval stuff that you needed to date. But it creates problems for us because a single date might as well, in some cases, and you're probably going to correct me, might as well be no date, because we cannot critique it. We cannot verify that it is actually a correct date for that feature. And why? Because the material that we're dating could be residual, it could be intrusive, or it could simply be a wrong date as well. And we're going to hear more about all these issues and how we can kind of tackle them by choosing samples. But on a very basic level, we cannot critique them, we cannot interrogate them if there's only one of them. We need more per feature. Second problem, we cannot create models, and you're going to learn all about Bayesian models in a moment and why we should be keen on them and why we are interested in them, because they actually allow us to create chronologies for sites and to actually, in doing so, also restrain the characteristically rather wide, well, you're going to explain it better, but the chronological kind of vagueness that is inherent to radiocarbon dates with their ranges. So single dates per sites and contexts are in themselves very problematic. And then choices. Why do we select, and this is something I want to come back to, why do we select certain features? Why do we not select here the double slot or double post structure? Why do we choose to date the pit that sits on top of it? What does that pit represent? What are we trying to find out about people's lives in the past that that pit can answer? I think that structure consisting of 2 parallel rows of posts is going to tell us something about the construction of a shelter here on this side. We can then start to think about what activities took place within this. We can look at, is this a landscape in which sites are frequent? Is this a period in which sites are frequent or rare? What does it tell us about people's liveways? That pit, more than likely, is not going to tell us anything besides somebody dug a pit and chucked some stuff in there. Sample selection, again, something that we will come back to repeatedly. Sometimes even the dates that we do have are actually not helping us really, not just because there's one date, but because the date itself is not helping us to date the context. So you say, why is that? An example here is a ring ditch, which is probably, in all likelihood, some sort of monument related to funerary activities. And a hazelnut shell was dated from its context. That is something people have started to do increasingly over past decades, because the big lesson we were taught about 10 years ago is we have to date stuff that is in its essence itself of a known age. So we can tell in the case of the hazelnut it's maximum 1 year old, right? Whereas if we take a big lump of charcoal, that could be old wood effect, 200 years, so stay away from charcoal. But what we, and that is going to, what we're going to learn from Derek today, is it's really about, does that hazelnut relate to that ring ditch at all? No, it could be intrusive, it could be residual, because it has, in all likelihood, no functional relationship to the actual burial or the digging of the ring ditch. Can you think of a scenario in which this hazelnut actually was part of the process that brought it into that ditch? It might have been by accident on the pyre or something like that, but chances are it was knocking around on the site and somehow got integrated in that fill. Okay, so back to the phullagts. Here from Southeast Ireland, radiocarbon dates from various phullagts chucked together into one graph, and we've gone through them and we've made those green that are from the troughs. And you can see here, there's a bit better size. You can see the ones from the troughs, they are all kind of behaving themselves and staying behind or staying pretty much before 800 or 700 BC. So I took away the chronology scale there, so excuse me. But trust me when I say this is about 800, 700 BC. So that is nicely where also other things in the late Bronze Age are coming to an end, 800 BC internationally, so that is really interesting. And we see that the black ones that are actually from the Burnt Mound component of these sites, they can be of any date really, and particularly also of later dates. And even and when we started to kind of interrogate those sites a bit further, we would then often also, if they're kind of extremely late, find evidence for disturbances, etc. So that is something that is really good and kind of starts to allow us to narrow the chronology of the overall phenomenon down a bit more. But per site, we only have very limited amount of numbers, though phullagts can be really complex sites with a variety of different troughs, with activity areas, with stakeholders, with, as you see here, for example, 3 troughs on this side here, and then various other things going on, though they're entirely or really, really complex sites with probably really interesting, exciting processes of how they're formed over time. And we could be looking at frequency of use, we could be looking at duration of use, is it intermittent, are people coming back, etc., etc. So loads of different questions I'd be keen to know, and not the least, where do they sit within the late Bronze Age? At the moment we just have to chuck them all into a big pot that's called late Bronze Age. But surely that's a long period. There's development, societal developments happening that would be really interesting to be able to grasp. So what I would like to be able to do is work with a few sites that are complex in terms of the archaeology and have a good set of dates that we then can use as an example to study how people actually created the site over time, rather than having another 5 or 10 where there's a trough and one single date. So we have choices at this point about how we want to move forward. We can continue to do a kind of random approach, and I know that's a very loose term now, and there's a lot of restrictions on you as well in terms of project management, of timing of processes, of the whole setup, and I hope we have a discussion about that in the end as well. If there's such a random approach to be continued, I think we need to at least make sure that when excavation happens, we have a conscious selection of samples for future use or by third parties, which brings with it retention and storage issues, which we probably need to tackle as a profession very actively as well. Or we need to start talking about research or question informed strategic dating of sites that will prioritize quality over quantity, focus on meaningful site types that we have actually a need for understanding for, and look at things in a regional context as well. Is this a region where we already have a lot of stuff on phullagts? Do we need to date another one here? Or is this a region where this is more interesting and would further our understanding of this particular landscape or this monument type nationally, etc.? So that's something I think we should come back to and discuss. And I would hand over to Derek now to tell you about what we could be doing if we modified our strategy perhaps a little bit.